It's not as far you though, because I'm like, just in case I don't worry about that much. He's on 26. There's a new repair. Yeah, that's gonna be fine. It's good. Like, it's kind of like a reward. Take all these tasks and you gotta do.
Yeah.
That's your third time reading it? Oh, it's book itself.
All right, good morning.
Only
Only be 75. I'm loving this weather. It feels like fall. I love it. I put like half of my Halloween decorations up outside yesterday. I'm feeling accomplished. It's gonna take me forever. I made like a huge tunnel and I really went over the top. My kids were last year were like, our decorations are weak. I was like, oh, that's not nice, right? Like, and so this year I'm like, all right, challenge accepted. Here we go, right? So I'm going all out this year on my outdoor decorations. We'll see. Anyway, I wrote that up there. I won't see you on Monday, right? So we have our exam. We talked about it last time. Just to remind you, exam number 1 is on Monday. And so on Monday, it will open up at 12:01 a.m. as we talked about before, and it'll close at 11:59 p.m. So as I said, you can take it at this time. You have this time free since we're not meeting, or you can take it anytime during the day, but please make sure you do take it, right? 100 points. You don't want to miss out on that. Don't forget to study with the study guide, all of that for Monday. So we talked about it before, but any questions, anything about the exam? Feeling okay? Hopefully. All right. We will finish up with chapter 5 today. So we spent a lot of time last time talking about, right, if I go back here, the different stress disorders, how stress affects us. Remember, the only difference between ASD and PTSD is how long they last and when it starts, right? ASD being much shorter lasting, happening much faster, PTSD being a much longer term disorder. We talked about the symptoms and triggers and CPTSD and why people develop stress disorders and treatment, right? So today what we'll focus on is the other half of the chapter, which are the dissociative disorders. And these aren't super common in some ways, and in other ways, elements of them can be very common. It's pretty common for people to dissociate at some point. When you dissociate, it's almost like you check out for a short period of time. Maybe you're not in touch with your surroundings, or things don't feel real to you, or you have some kind of memory loss for periods of time where you had a lot of stress or trauma or something happen. There's a couple of different disorders in this category, and all of them tend to involve some kind of memory loss, some kind of like checking out of reality or things feeling unreal, changes of identity, or even having multiple identities, which we'll talk about as well. So a couple of different things here. Again, the disorders themselves aren't necessarily common, but the elements of them and symptoms of them can be a symptom of a lot of different disorders. So what we'll talk about first are the dissociative amnesias. Amnesia is when you forget, right? When you have a hard time remembering something, or something has been like removed from your memory or blocked out of your memory. All of these that are up here, these dissociative amnesias, are memory loss without any kind of physical cause. Now, there are cases where people hit their head or have brain trauma or head trauma and they forget. That is different from this, right? So if you like get in a really bad car accident and you have memory loss for what happened due to head trauma, that's different from dissociative amnesia. That's called like retrograde amnesia, when you have a physical incident. These ones are due to psychological factors. So people have memory loss due to some kind of trauma or stress or something emotional or mental rather than physical. And there are 5 different types of dissociative amnesia. And this would be a wonderful short answer question for you, right? What are the 5 types of dissociative amnesia? And you would just list them for me. And I won't ask you anything about the differences between the first 4 because they're kind of confusing. but I might ask you a little bit separately about this one because it's its own defined term. So let's talk about the 5 different types a little bit more, especially the last one. The last one's probably the most fascinating, and we'll get there in a second. People can have localized, selective, generalized, continuous, or dissociative fugue when it comes to memory loss due to trauma. And so with all of these, they're a little bit different. So localized is when the memory loss begins with some kind of traumatic event, right? And so this is really the most common. Like, let's say, again, somebody has something traumatic happen to them, and you don't remember kind of everything that happened, right? It begins with the traumatic event. So maybe you remember everything leading up to it and everything after it, but you don't remember what happened during the event itself. Very, very common. And all of these tend to come back, right, after a period of time, right? It might be days, it might be weeks, it might be hours, right? But your memory does tend to come back eventually. Selective is also really common. People remember bits and pieces of a traumatic event. A lot of people after like the attacks on 9/11 said that they remembered like the attack, but they don't remember how they got out of the building, but they remembered like bits and pieces of it. That's actually pretty common. When something bad happens, it's like your brain, bless you, only remembers little elements of it, but not everything. These 2 are really rare, generalized and continuous. Generalized is when you forget everything that led up to the trauma. So you might forget who you are, right? Like your entire identity, right? At least for a period of time. It's kind of forgetting before the event. Right? It's actually pretty uncommon. And continuous is when you forget everything after the event. It's almost like you can't make new memories after the event has happened. Both of these don't happen very often, but they are ways that memory loss can occur. And then the last one is completely different, and it's called a dissociative fugue. And you hear stories about this in the news every now and then. It's when somebody usually starts and goes on a journey away from home, and they assume a partial or complete new identity with no memory of who they were before. Fugue is Latin for flight, like to run away or to flee, right? And so what you often see with this is that somebody will experience a lot of stress or trauma, and then they take off and travel a distance away from their home and assume a new or like partially new identity with no memory for who they are or their identity that they left behind. Now, and people who have this tend to do it more than once, right? The first time tends to be the most disruptive, obviously. And oftentimes what happens is people travel and they try to assume a new identity, but they don't have any of the documentation or anything to support it. And so it kind of falls through relatively quickly. Used to be easier to do than it is now, with all the documentation you need to have. But people will go and they'll enter into a new relationship, go get a new job, leaving behind partners and jobs and kids and responsibilities. I found a news story of this, which isn't always the easiest to find. So I was super excited to find it. It's a few years old, but let me play it for you. It's about a man who just took off and then he had no idea who he was. And so he went to the news to try and see if anyone recognized him. And that tends to be what happens with this. And again, your memory does come back, but it can take days or even weeks for you to remember. People start to get this sense that something is wrong, and oftentimes do what this man does, which is go to somebody for help. There was another case of this a few years ago. There was a young woman who lived in, I want to say it was Arizona, if I remember correctly, and she was about to get married. She was engaged to be married. Her wedding was coming up, and she disappeared out of nowhere. She just was gone. No one could find her. And 2 weeks later, they found her. She had gone all the way across the country. She was sleeping with and in a relationship with some other random guy that she had just met. And her fiance was absolutely livid about this when they interviewed him. She had tried to get a new job, and she had no memory of anything that she left behind, right? Again, very rare, but it comes from this idea of a flight or taking off from home, usually in response to stress, and again, kind of starting a new identity. And people start to feel, as I said, something is off or wrong, but they can't put their finger on it. And it can take a little bit of time for that to come come back, and hope they don't do too much damage in the time that they've assumed that new identity, right? If I remember correctly, that couple didn't end up getting married. Right? And he was very upset. Yeah, Jake.
Like when this happened to somebody, when you say like, oh, they wake up on like a street, like what is the key moment that like where they just like lose all their memories? So like they obviously leave home. Is it at that point where their memory's all like gone, or does it like when they wake up or when they, I don't know, I guess like when does the, I guess maybe it depends on the person, but like.
So usually in their travel, like most of the time people drive, right? And
Yeah.
so it's like they enter into almost like a hypnotic state when they're driving, right? And they're taking off, like it's slow. It's almost like a fog creeps in, is the way that I've heard it described. And like they just kind of lose any kind of memory or awareness of where they were coming from. Yeah, it's really, there's not a lot known about this. Like the dissociative disorders are a little bit like, they almost have like a mystical quality to them at times, right? Like a little almost supernatural quality to them in some ways. And so I don't know if we know specifically when that moment occurs. It's like I said, it's almost like a fog slowly rolls in and they forget who they were.
Yeah, and I guess I'm like if let's say the person can't like myself, like somebody who can't drive.
Sure.
How would it work for someone like that where they literally couldn't?
Yeah.
Like
you probably wouldn't develop it. Right. Interestingly, you might go a different route, something like either one of the other types of amnesia, or maybe even creating another identity to compensate for it instead. So it's interesting, like people go different routes with these, but yeah, it's like a fog rolls in and then the fog rolls out when their memory comes back. It's the best way I've heard it described, but kind of unsatisfying at the same time. Yeah.
Is there any changes in the brain?
Yeah, I'm not sure that we've done things like PET scans because it's so rare, right? I'm not sure that we have any like fMRIs or PET scans to see what's happening in the brain. That would be fascinating to do, right? To see like what areas of the brain are highlighting or like maybe not lighting up. I don't think that we've had that opportunity, but it would be amazing to do. Yeah.
I have a friend with amnesia and I met her after she had it.
Sure.
Few years after. But she and her husband were both DJs, still are, and had their own DJ companies. And then she had nursed her mom through cancer. Her mom passed, and then her dad took his life, and she's an only child.
Wow.
And so she kind of just slid down the door. She was against. Her husband picked her up, took her to bed. She cried herself to sleep. And then it took a couple days for her to realize she had lost everything except the past year, which sucked.
Right.
And so it's just been really like for a while. They called her old Jamie. There's old Jamie and there's new Jamie. New Jamie ordered some vanilla ice cream, and then her husband's like, "You don't like vanilla." So she lost her best friend, couldn't handle it.
Yeah.
She had to work. They had to work their marriage back to a new marriage. And got remarried and had a new reception.
Wow.
She don't remember anything.
Yeah.
But it
never came back, huh?
Like into the doctor quickly. Like and she has since lost a couple more years, which is terrifying.
Okay.
But
and it's all due to the emotional stuff. No like physical reason for it, right? Yeah. I mean, and Freud would call it like a form of repression, right? Like you experience something you couldn't handle, so you push it down. And it may or may not come back. Usually it comes back, but it might require things like therapy or hypnosis or something to kind of get you there. Wild. Yeah, it happens. It's not the most common, but it does happen. What's more common is just something that's hard for your brain and you to process and deal with, that you block out small elements of it, right? Which are still there. That just might be very difficult to access, right? We were talking about EMDR last time, and it might be that you access them through like hypnosis or something like EMDR to help work through and digest those memories so that you can move forward. Yeah, it's challenging. That's a lot to handle. Another disorder here, depersonalization and derealization disorder. All right, so with this one, there's two different elements. They used to be separate, but they put them together in the new DSM. Elements of these two, people experiencing depersonalization or derealization are actually really common. They're very common symptoms of things like depression, anxiety, panic attacks, right? A lot of different disorders. But the main disorder up here, DDD, is it sometimes called, depersonalization, derealization disorder, isn't very common. So having this disorder, not so common, these two symptoms, relatively common, if that makes sense. So with this disorder, people have recurrent episodes of feeling depersonalization, derealization, or both. And so what these are, depersonalization is when you feel like things are like unreal, right? It feels like your body is unreal. You feel detached from your body, like maybe elements of your body feel like unfamiliar to you in some way. Versus derealization is when your surroundings feel unreal and feel like you feel detached from them. Sometimes like there's a fog or like a layer between you and the world around you. Very common to experience during panic attacks or during extreme anxiety or stress, that people kind of check out. Everything feels blurry or unreal. I was sharing with you that I did EMDR as part of my training for like being like credentialed in EMDR. And very common after an episode, like I would leave and like nothing felt real. Like I'd get home and be like, how did I get here? Like I would get there and I'm like, oh, I'm glad I didn't, have any issues on my drive here because I don't remember it. Like, or driving home, everything would feel foggy. And that's a very common description for derealization. Depersonalization is a little less common. And I found a little video. I'm just going to play the first 2 minutes of it. They describe some of those symptoms a little bit. And I thought it was kind of helpful that I like the way that he kind of puts that, and the words on the screen I think are helpful too. But this is something that a lot of people will experience. Again, these symptoms are relatively common. They're very common with PTSD and CPTSD, which we talked about like last time. And again, like I said, panic attacks and so on. Derealization more so than the first one. Anybody, I saw a lot of you nodding when I was talking about these. I mean, any like comments or stories or thoughts or anything? Yeah.
I just remember like one time like in school, I like walked into the bathroom and I like saw myself in the mirror, and literally the first thing that like pops in my head was, who is that?
Yeah.
Like I was just like, and like it took me like a good like 5 minutes to just stand there and look at myself, and I was just like, that's not me. That's not my body.
Yeah.
That's not what I look like.
How scary.
And then like I was just like, what? And then it went away, and I was just like, and then I was like, why did I think that? Because I was like, after I was out of it, I was like, no, that's me. My face hasn't changed.
Yeah.
And I was just like, afterwards, I was just like, huh, that's weird.
Yeah.
I don't know why I thought that wasn't me, because that has always been me. So what I've always looked like. So it's just like a very weird experience. Just question who you are.
Yeah.
And just be like, huh, that's not me.
Yeah, and that's definitely the first one, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like, oh my gosh, like who's that? Like
Yeah.
it's you,
Yeah.
but it doesn't like register on some level.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It's an odd experience.
Yeah. Oh, very, right? Yeah.
Related to the personalization one,
Sure.
strangely a lot, because I'll be in work, and then sometimes I'll just be going through the motions because I'll be repeating the same lines and phrases over and over again for an 8-hour period.
Uh-huh.
People that I won't remember until I say my own life, because I can't remember customers. And sometimes I just be in the moment and I'm just like, but I'm gonna just take a back seat to it. I'm just going autopilot. Right?
Yeah.
And then things don't even go by, and then I realize 5 hours went by, and then I remember, oh, sun was out when I was last conscious, and then now it's like now before my shit.
Yeah.
Back. But it's not like an odd experience. It's like I'm fully aware of it.
Right.
Not really putting so much thought into it.
Yeah, the autopilot is kind of a good way of thinking about it, right? And we enter into these like trances a lot. I mean, I gave you the example of driving. I imagine every single one of you have had that moment, right? Where you get somewhere and you're like, I'm glad I'm here. Like, I don't remember any of that. Like, because we do it so often, it becomes like routine and autopilot. Like, I'll have that moment a lot. Like, I'll leave here and go home. I mean, I've done this drive like every day for like 15 years at this point. Like, it's almost autopilot. And like, you get into like this different like trance like state. And yeah, it's not like you're not aware. I mean, you're still interacting, you're still doing everything, but it's a different state than like when you're consciously interacting in a different way. Yeah. I'll go here and then right back to you. Yeah.
It's a similar way to describe like when you zone out,
Yeah,
kind of like that.
just to more of an extreme, right?
Okay,
So dissociation is like zoning out to the extreme, if that makes sense.
okay, because I'm doing that right now. It's like I walk into your. And I see you, and all of a sudden I know some things I didn't understand.
Sure. Well, I'm glad that you're not 100% zoned out. I mean, we all daydream. Daydreaming is zoning out, right? Daydreaming is totally normal, like, and there's nothing wrong with it. As long as you're not doing it the entire time, right? Like if like after an hour and 15 minutes, you're like, oh, oops, right? Like then it gets in the way. But daydreaming or zoning out or like autopilot, like we all do it. Like we all check out. Dissociating is a little more severe, right? So it's like you're not even here enough to process the information that's happening in your environment. Yeah.
So like last year, me and my buddies were going camping like every weekend,
Yeah.
and one time we just had like a bunch of like issues, like the trucks were breaking down and all. So we got on like 2, 3 in the morning, and then like I remember I was unloading my bike. My dad's like, "Oh, how's the drive?" Like, I don't really know.
Yeah.
Um,
It happened.
but he used to be a truck driver, so he could
Yeah.
like some advice. He was like, "Yeah, like when you're driving and you're tired, just sometimes the aliens come and just take you, and you
Yeah, right. I mean, long drives when you're tired, like it's very easy to kind of go in that autopilot, like hypnotic trance kind of mode, right? It happens to all of us, right? There are a couple other hands. Yeah.
So it's.
This, so DDD up at the top, yes. These two are symptoms or elements of it, but the one on the top is an actual disorder where these happen to people repeatedly, right? To have them every now and then, very normal, but to have them so severely and repeatedly is where you start to get toward the disorder.
Because I used to work at like a rehab and like a lot of the clients would describe like
Yeah.
exactly like the personalization and
Sure.
so it's weird if that's like just like something circumstance or
So you see it a lot in a lot of different disorders, like the two elements of it, and if you're having both of them all the time, then that. Like, there was yeah.
So I disassociate a lot and I have a problem to where I can see the person talking to me, but I don't know how to react. Like, it's just like I'm watching them. And so it's like, it's just the weirdest thing. It's just like, I can see it and I know that they're looking at me, but I can't process that they're expecting like me to know them. Does that make sense? It's like,
Yeah.
it's the weirdest thing. It's like, I can process that it's real, they're talking to me, but I'm just like staring at them. Like, I don't know how to react. I'm like,
Sure.
I'm just like in a trance.
Yeah, and then so maybe a little bit of that going on, right? Like, and again, if it's not interfering and it happens, every now and then, it's probably not like a huge issue, but if it causes problems, right, then it could be something that requires, some help with, okay? Yeah, I'll go over there and Jake, I'll do next. Yeah.
I just remember there was one time in my life where I was like in a really, really awful spot, like super depressed, suicidal all the time. And this would happen to me so much in that time where I would feel like sometimes I'd feel super detached from myself. It's like I'm sinking back into my head.
Yeah.
And I would hear myself talking, but like I didn't feel like I was talking. Or and well, when this happened, I did end up having to go to a psych ward for it, but the whole time I was there, it was like nothing was real. And it was just so like such a dream-like thing. Yeah, it was so weird. But like the similar thing happens to me when I perform an audition. Like I'll be up there performing 1 second and then I get off and I'm like, what just happened? Like I just did that and I have no memory of doing it.
Yeah. Right, and that like that dream like follows you is a good way to, right? It can feel very unreal and sometimes hard to remember. Yeah, Jake, what's up?
So like I remember like a few years ago, I was like coding and I was like so into what I was doing. It was like and then I'm like checking tell them, wait, is it like 4 in the morning already? Like I had no idea that much time passed and I was just so into what I was doing. It was like wow, I have to be up at like 10 a.m. to like a class the next day. I'm like, yeah, this is not really fun. I'm like, okay, I'll try to get some sleep. I actually kind of ended up like I was like out, like what happened is my brain I was out cold, like I was like in such a deep sleep, like I actually got like a call from the person who was teaching that class. Like, are you there? Like, what happened? Like, oh yeah, I was, like being up to like 4 in the morning voting, like, you know, and I kind of screwed up. But my sleep schedule actually screwed up quite a bit all the time. It's like, it's incredible that like I need to be here right now because like some, right now my sleep schedule is normal, but other times it's like my sleep schedule is really off. So it's like I get in these moments where it's like I get so into like what I'm doing, I forget what
Sure. Yeah, and this is really common, right? Like that happens to all of us, right? Definitely a little different from this, but it's kind of like, again, that trance-like state where you lose awareness of the environment around you. That's much more common than like to take it to the next level with the depersonalization, derealization. Yeah.
Does depersonalization have anything to do with what we talked about in one of the previous chapters, where people feel like their arms aren't like theirs?
That would be like the extreme version of it, right? With that body integrity identity disorder, that amputee, like that would be like to the extreme with it, right? Yeah, so it could, but like different levels of severity of it. Yeah. No, so we'll talk about, I guess we did talk about body dysmorphia in the last chapter. That's more where like you feel like part of you is like deformed or grotesque in some way, and you feel like you have to change it or people are staring at it. Little bit different. Right. Yeah. One is like, I'm unhappy with my nose versus like, my nose is not mine and I feel like I need someone to remove it now. Right. Little bit different, but I'm kind of, again, on the same spectrum, right? Just severe ends, different ends of this one. So probably the most famous in this category, or the most like dramatic of them all, dissociative identity disorder. Now, this used to be called multiple personality disorder or split personality disorder. A lot of movies made on this, often portrayed very inaccurately in movies as well. But with this disorder, people have more than one identity or personality that routinely takes over. And there's often a lot of memory loss that can come with this. So the sub personalities, as they're called, are these like distinct identities or maybe fragments of identities. So it used to be called multiple personalities, but what we think now is that that maybe these are like fragmented, dissociated identities within a person. So that's why they changed the name of it. They're not always well-developed personalities, but with this disorder, someone has 2 or more different identities or sub-personalities that can take over their person, right? And they might have memory loss depending on the relationship between the identities. Really wild disorder, very controversial. A lot of people think it's being faked. It's usually having roots in like extreme trauma and distress. And the relationship between the identities and personalities plays a big role in how difficult this is for somebody to deal with. Okay, so the most difficult of all of them would be that the personalities are mutually amnesic, which means that they have no awareness of each other. So personality A doesn't know about B, and B doesn't know about F, and F doesn't know about T, right? They don't know about each other. When that happens, there's a lot of memory loss because you only remember what happened when you're the same personality. So if like you're A today and B tomorrow, you have no awareness of what happened yesterday. So by far the most difficult. Mutually cognizant is the easiest. That means they are all aware of each other. And if they're all aware of each other, they share memory, and you can actually ask that person to switch personalities. So can I talk to B? And B can come forward because they all have awareness of each other. Much easier to deal with. The third one is the most common, where there's like one dominant personality. And the dominant knows about all the subs, but the subs don't know about each other. So when you're the dominant personality, you can switch, you share all those memories, but the ones who are like the sub-personalities have no awareness of each other at all. So depending on the relationship between these different identities, it dictates how hard it is and how much memory loss there is. There's a lot of memory loss with this disorder. People have blackouts, as they sometimes call them, and they don't remember what happened when they were the other personality. Yeah, did you have a...
Yeah. So I know you said like the sub-personalities don't know about each other, but do the sub-personalities know about the dominant one?
Not if it's this one.
They don't know about any of that.
Right, so only the dominant one has awareness of everything, and the other ones have no idea. Yeah. Yeah,
So when I was introducing this disorder in my 8th psychology class back in high school,
yeah,
the book that we were specifically reading from highlighted the controversy surrounding this disorder. Because when the system economy, the DSI higher than the United States along the case rate for just piling up and piling up.
yeah.
And it was only found exclusively in the United States or everywhere else where you can find this disorder. So I don't know if you knew about that or you.
Yeah, I mean, part of that is so the United States uses the DSM, right, to categorize disorders. Other countries use something called the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases. So a different way of categorizing, and different cultures view these things in different ways. Like in Ireland, this isn't a thing. Like it's not considered a problematic disorder. It's just a variant of human behavior, right? So different cultures tend to have different takes on this. It is a controversial disorder in a lot of ways. That's one of them. And the other is just like, how do you prove someone's not faking it? You know, and they've done a lot of like brain scans on people with this disorder. And we see different brain patterns emerge from different personalities. It's been pretty well like validated, but there are a lot of cultural elements to this and different beliefs from in different places of the world. Much more common here where we use the DSM than people who use other classification systems.
I think it was the ones that was really criticized and understand was the other data.
Yeah, it's interesting though. Yeah, it's not universally accepted, but it is much more common here than in other places. Yeah. No, right. So you'd be stuck, as they said, until you switch. So when you're the dominant, you can easily go to one of the subpersonalities, but then that subpersonality doesn't realize they're a sub. And so you have to wait for yourself to switch back automatically, which usually happens due to like stress, or trauma, or a trigger of some kind. The thought is that the personalities serve a purpose. And so when that purpose is done for that sub, you will default back to the dominant. Right.
So if we just have a big gap, like around.
Yep. Yeah, you might have days to weeks, you know, or just hours. Yeah, people often have big gaps in the memory from when they switch from one to the other, which is difficult to deal with. A lot of journaling and keeping diaries is helpful. You'll see different handwriting styles and different like ways of communicating. These personalities can be wildly different. You could have one who's very young and very old, one who's male, one who's female, like memories that they have.
People that might could be in jail.
Oh, that is such a big ethical question, right? And it has happened
You didn't do it.
a couple of times. Yeah, I mean, it comes up in cases that even when people try to fake having multiple personalities, saying that like, oh, personality A did it, not me, right? But that's a huge ethical one, right? There's a really cool movie. It's good for this time of year too, called Identity. I think John Cusack is the main guy in it, but the whole movie, I don't want to ruin it because it's a really like whole psychological twist, but there's an element of that. Yeah.
I was on the same wavelength, thinking about one personality performing criminal activity and then faking it, like the whole situation or the whole conversation was same wavelength with both of you.
Yeah, it's not
So
common because it's not a common disorder, but it can happen, right? And like so, I mean, that individual might be found insane because they weren't able, like they didn't actually commit the crime. It's tricky. That is a hallucination and they think they're doing something that's real and it wasn't. Again, it gets tricky. We'll talk about that in the very last chapter of the semester. Yeah, did you have your hand up again? Yeah, that would be like, so likely that person would be found like not guilty by reason of insanity and they would go to a psychiatric hospital instead of prison. where they might stay the rest of their life, but it wouldn't be jail necessarily.
Excellent on that. I watched this documentary on Netflix. I can't remember exactly what it's called, something, the faces, I think it was Billy Milligan or something. And it was this guy, I can't remember if he actually murdered someone or not, but I know he was definitely a rapist. And there was like a whole controversy on whether or not he was faking this disorder or not. But it was like due to this trauma that he had as a kid, and it was one personality held that trauma.
Right.
And while the other ones were there to keep him from that. And so what happened was, like, when he was younger, he became super suicidal because of that trauma. And then that's when his other personalities made that personality go down so that he wouldn't kill himself.
Yeah, wild, right? It is usually rooted in trauma, right? Like something traumatic happens and it's so bad that you can't process what happened, so you create another identity where it didn't happen to that person, and they can. So I've seen this in person once. Like, I have a story that I'll share with you once, and it was wild because I didn't see it coming. So my first semester as a therapist trainee, right? My very first semester, one of my very first clients had this and didn't know. And I didn't know. It was very exciting. So I saw this young woman for, I want to say like 7 weeks, really quiet. Best description would be like mousy, quiet, depressed, struggling with being away at college. She missed her family. She didn't have a lot of friends, very like introverted, shy. And I diagnosed her with depression. Okay, because she was really like sad and having a hard time. I saw her 6, 7 weeks, nothing eventful, depressed, quiet, timid every time. And then like week 7 or 8, she comes in and was so off the charts different, right? Like talking a million miles a minute, talking about people she had never talked about before. I thought she was having a manic episode. Okay, so in my mind, I was like, she has bipolar disorder. I just haven't seen this side of it yet. I'm seeing it now. That happens, right? Sometimes you have to adjust and you don't always see like everything right away. And so as a therapist trainee, you are videotaped, which is awkward. You have to watch that with your supervisor and go through it, which is not the most fun. And you also meet with a supervisor after every session for just a couple of minutes to check in because you're learning, right? You have to make sure. So I met with my supervisor after the session. We changed her diagnosis to bipolar 1 and I moved on. Like I didn't think anything of it. She comes in the following week back to quiet, mousy, depressed again. And I'm like, okay, she's cycled back in my mind. And the first thing she says to me, here's where it gets interesting, right? First thing she says is, I want to apologize for missing our session last week. And I was like, oh, I'm glad that you brought it up. I'm like, you were here, but I'm glad you brought it up. You were really different last week. And I wanted to talk to you about that. Like to see if, you're having episodes like that, more than you just did last week. And she's like, to be honest, I don't remember where I was last week, but I know I didn't come and that's really not like me. And I'm sorry. And I was like, well, you were here. And I pull out my notes, right? And I'm like, you mentioned this and this and this and this and this. And she's like, I don't know who those people are. Are you sure you don't have me confused with somebody else? And I was all like, like she was so kind about it, but it was that like, no, that's not me. You're like confused, right? And I was like, well, and I double check my notes, like, in my mind, I'm like, I'm not. I didn't say that, but in my mind, I was all like, I
probably would have gotten me in trouble, but like, that was the evidence, it's right there.
Nope, we did that, right? So we went back and forth for like 20 minutes. Like I was like, you were here, you talked about X. And she's like, no, I wasn't here. I didn't talk about that. And I'm like sitting there the whole time going like, I'm 99% sure that I am correct about this, right? So we couldn't move forward because she was so adamant that she wasn't here. And it felt off, like red flags going off for me. And so I was like, you know what, if you don't mind, like, I am videotaped as part of like this process. I'm gonna go get the videotape and my supervisor. Okay, so I went and got my supervisor. I got the videotape. We played it. She was there. I wasn't wrong, right? Like I had a moment, right? Like I was starting to doubt myself. And we played the videotape. She just starts sobbing. She's like, that's me. But what am I wearing? Who am I talking about? I don't remember that. I'm sitting there going like, this is why I love psychology. Like my mind was just blown, right? Like never seen this again in person ever. And it turned out she had been having blackouts and she developed an extroverted, very outgoing personality to deal with her depression and struggles of being away from home. And she didn't know it. And like she was having all these periods of time that she didn't remember. And that was I had to like send her away to somebody else because I wasn't qualified to help her. And I never got to see her again. And I always wondered like how it went. And I'll never know. But she had this disorder and didn't know. Right. And so, it can happen. Like that wasn't even to her, that was extreme stress. Right. It could be trauma, but for her, that was what triggered it. Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Or you learn better like social skills and how to like be outgoing, then that personality won't be needed. And not go away.
Something else that I don't know, I'm asking so many questions, but like something else that I'm curious about is like, let's say your personality B is asked to verify information, like so for a credit card,
Yeah.
like that. But like that information is obviously like that can be traced back to the person that actually exists. So how is that? Like what happens, what happens in those situations? Like what information is provided? They just make up bogus numbers?
Yeah.
Or like, why do you know what happens in those situations?
I mean, they might not know. It might just be a like, not sure. And I'm not sure why I can't remember. Would be the most likely option. I would think, unless they're mutually cognizant, in which case they would know. Right?
Like
If they share
post
memory, they would
information, like they share the host.
Yep.
photos.
If they were mutually cognizant, they would know it all, right? And they would be able to say it. So that was my one, like I said, my one experience with this. What I wonder to this day, it still eats at me. How did she know to come that day? Like, how did she know to come to therapy if she had never met me? Like, she didn't interact with me in a way where like I was unfamiliar. It wasn't like she walked in and was like, who are you? Like she knew me and was comfortable and familiar with me just as somebody else. Right. And so I don't know if it was like in her planner and she was just like, oh, okay, I'll go to that. Like, I don't know. Like, to this day, I wonder, right? So they must have had some shared memory. It just might not have been like solidified yet. Yeah.
Wouldn't that be the one way?
It could be. Yeah. Yeah. So it could be that like,
The outgoing one knows everything.
Right.
Like the. Like,
and the one with the one that's dominant isn't always the primary personality, which is where it can get really tricky as well. I think you were next. Did you have a?
I have another kind of hard ethical question.
Sure.
And I'm interested with your experience and background, how you would navigate a situation with somebody who's kind of like fragile around this, in a sense where like you can tell there's inconsistencies and they could be faking it.
Yeah.
How do you address like
Yeah.
if they're kind of committed to that? Like could that be possibly really like earth shattering if they really believe they have it but don't, like, does that make sense? How would you navigate?
Like if they were faking it, you mean?
Yeah, if they were really attached to that.
Yeah, and we're gonna in the next chapter we'll talk about like Munchausen's and faking and stuff, which are things like the things people do. And so if you suspect that someone is like faking it, I mean, it would depend on the severity. Like for me, I think I'd be tempted to try and like trap them in it. So I would go along with it, but I would be looking for the inconsistencies for my own like well-being. Yeah, and it would depend on your relationship with them. I mean, that would be tricky. I mean, there are a lot of people who try and fake it, right? And it can be faked. Like you could easily fake this if you wanted to, and you're a good enough actor or actress, right? I mean, that's tricky. I mean, I think I would just try and notice and gather as much information as possible to see what, and then decide what I'm going to do with it. Yeah. I mean, it could be something that you confront them about or you let go. It's kind of going to have to be one you decide. Did you have a thought too?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, like, even with it not being like, say like we both are, like it's a mutually music like situation, things like habits and like facial recognition and stuff like that, aren't those like those would be stored in a different part of the brain, right? So like would it be possible for different personalities to still access that like facial recognition part where it's like, maybe I don't know exactly why I'm here, but I
Right.
do recognize you.
It could
And
be.
like you seem familiar enough, and it's like, I know it's like almost like a habit, like,
Yeah.
huh, I know that this thing happens. I don't know why, because like I've never been here before, but I know I need to go to this thing
Sure.
today. And I recognize the person, so I'm just gonna go.
Yeah, it could be enough, right? And maybe there's enough of like a memory or like trigger there to make it seem familiar, even if you don't remember it all the way.
Yeah.
But then on the flip side of that, people can have such different mannerisms and behaviors and facial expressions and everything when they switch personality. Sometimes that's the biggest tell that someone has switched is their body language can really be very different.
So, like, does the brain like, I don't know, like, because there's so many like different parts of our brains that store all kinds of different information. So then like, is all of the brains completely like acting differently, or is it just like only a small portion?
Yeah.
Like it's like so weird.
It's so interesting, right? And I'm not sure we know.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there's so much that we don't know. We don't understand sleep and dreams. And we dream and sleep over a third of our life away, right? Like if you sleep 8 hours a night, you sleep 1/3 of your life, right? That's wild, right? Some of us sleep way more than that or way less than that. And right. And we don't know, and we don't understand sleep, right? Let alone this. So it's wild how much we still don't know
Yeah.
in psychology, which is exciting, but frustrating at times too. Yeah. What was that?
Have you ever thought to?
I might have, yeah. That's totally possible, right? That might have been why she remembered on that day. And I only saw her, I never saw her after that. So it could have been that was the dominant.
She started listening to people.
Yeah, it could have been. Maybe that's it, right? I mean, it's hard to know. I will never know it. I wish I did. Yeah.
Is it possible to be born with the personality?
You could. It's usually, I mean, like 90-something% of the time, it's due to like trauma, right? It's almost every case that like we've looked at has some kind of like traumatic element to it, or like stress related element to it. I won't say it's impossible, but it's unlikely. It might be born with it in place, and then you would come to realization depending on the environment. Do you have a yeah. Yeah, and yeah, and I mean, some people have more like anxiety and fear sensitivity than others. So maybe that was the case that like her threshold for what she was dealing with was much lower than maybe was typical of average. And so that was traumatic to her, whereas it might not be traumatic to you or somebody else, right? And that's probably more like what would account. So again, almost exclusively due to trauma and stress is strama together, right? Trauma or stress. I've combined some good words in my life here, right? That one's a good one. Strama. I'm gonna write a book and call it that. Traumatic experiences or like stress or trauma. Freud said it was like an extreme repression, like kind of like we saw with the dissociative amnesia. And what we often do in cases of this is there's no like medication that you can take that's going to get rid of dissociation. It's dealing with the trauma that is going to help you get rid of that dissociative tendency. So it could be through like hypnosis, which isn't the most like validated type of therapy, but a lot of people do use hypnotic practices. Typically, there are 3 goals when people have dissociative identity disorder. The first one is to help them recognize the nature of the disorder. So identify what's going on. Okay, so this is what's happening, right? And let me educate you on the disorder. So here's where it gets tricky though. Like, so let's say personality A is forward and I educate personality A, but they switch to personality B. Now they have no idea what's going on and you have to educate B, right? And so it could be that takes a long time to do as you have to wait for personalities to emerge. But educating somebody and helping them recognize what's happening And then the big one is to recover gaps in memory. The memory losses are what makes this so incredibly difficult. So a lot of journaling and diary keeping, so you can know what's happening when you switch. And then trying to integrate them, which is called fusion. So again, if you can make a personality like irrelevant by like teaching someone skills that they don't have, or like finding out the function of that personality and then getting rid of it, you can fuse them from 8 down to 3, right? Or 3 down to 2, or 2 down to 1. And so that can take some time. It's like very long therapeutic process. And again, this movie is kind of about this. I don't want to ruin it, but kind of a cool take on this whole idea here. And there's a lot of really interesting like movies and shows. Probably one of my favorites, like Bates Motel. I don't know if any of you watched Bates when that was like a thing a few years ago. But the whole thing was about Norman Bates from Psycho and explaining that his murders were committed when he stepped into another personality, which was like a version of his mother. Really, really interesting. And they take this whole dissociative identity thing. He has blackouts. He switches to a version of his mother. In the show, they have him hallucinate his mother. That's more for us as viewers, right? People don't tend to hallucinate with this. Very different than schizophrenia. Okay, so schizophrenia is when people have one personality, but they have like delusions and hallucinations and things are fragmented. Versus dissociative identity, you have more than one personality. In theory, one of your personalities could have schizophrenia, and we can make it really wild and confusing, but that's not very common. They're very different disorders, but the media loves to blend them together. Like Fight Club is a great example of blending them together. A lot of movies do that, which is a little bit inaccurate. Are there any other like questions or thoughts, stories? Yeah. Yeah.
But if you look at baseball one, so everyone does.
Yeah. It could be, yeah. I mean, it could be that one personality has a disorder and one doesn't, and they could clash. It's definitely possible. Usually the identities aren't like fully developed, like personalities, which is again why they changed the name, but it's totally possible. And you could have one that has very like reckless bad choices that they make, and the other one's constantly dealing with it. Like that can definitely be the case. Yeah.
What are like to things that stop the therapy process of this, of like a personality trying its best not be needed anymore?
They might put up a fight, right? Like I don't want to be eliminated, right? Yeah, that can happen too. And so it's like working through all that and teaching skills to the primary personality that would help compensate for that. And so then what happens is that person doesn't need to switch as often because they have those skill sets now. And so that personality might slowly like fade over time. But then it could come back in a moment of like anxiety or stress or need. Yeah.
People develop personalities like imitate people. Like if I go something like when I'm President Obama or something.
Sure.
Is that thing that can happen?
That's more along the lines of like schizophrenia than anything. If you believe that you're somebody like famous, we call that like a delusion of grandeur. You believe you're somebody grand or important. So that would be more along the lines of like schizophrenia than this. Like if you believe that you were Obama and you started acting like Obama, I would suspect like delusions of grandeur and schizophrenia more than interesting, because it wouldn't be grounded in reality. Yeah. But you could have a personality that had schizophrenia and believed they were Obama, right? If we want to get wild with it, right? Sometimes people's personalities are like very young and don't even have the ability to speak. It's wild. I've kind of seen the range of it. Anything else? Any other questions or thoughts? Anything? Interesting, right? Like a super rare, not a common thing. But like I said, I've seen it once. So to dissociate is very common. A lot of us dissociate, all right? And it's often stress related. And then remember, these two symptoms up here are also relatively common, but the disorders themselves, to meet the full criteria for them, not as much. Okay? So we have like 14, I said 15 and then it changed. 14 minutes left, but I'm done with this. So I'll give you that extra time please don't forget about the exam on Monday. So I won't see you Monday. You have the test. Good luck. I hope you all do really well. And then when I see you on Wednesday, we're moving to chapter 8. We go out of order. So just to kind of put that in your mind, we go to something that's kind of an offshoot of this, which is chapter 8. So have a wonderful weekend. Good luck on the exam. I'll hang out up here if you have any questions at all.
Have a good day.
You too. Thank you. What's up?